Self-proclaimed as lifetime president, lord of all beasts of the earth and fish of the sea, and conqueror of the British Empire. In Africa, Idi Amin is one of the most extravagant and condemned personalities in recent African history. From soldiers serving the British crown in Uganda to a fierce president who expropriated and expelled the British and other foreigners from the country. His memory is one of violence and conflict. From being loyal to the West, Israel went on to serve Libya and the Soviet Union while his country's economy sank. An enigmatic figure that we are going to know today. Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia. And I invite you to leave your comments, to like the video, to share it with your acquaintances, and support us on our Patreon, which you can find below in the comments. Originating from a family belonging to the Eastern ethnic groups, Idi Amin was born in the city of Koboko, a province of the West Nile in Uganda. Historical records do not specify the exact date of his birth, but historians claim it was around the year 1925. His father, Andreas Niavir, belonged to the Kakwa, a small Islamic tribe spread across Uganda, Sudan, and the Congo, while his mother, Asa Ate, belonged to the Lugbara ethnic group. Shortly after Idi's birth, his parents separated while he and his mother moved to Lugasi, Uganda, near Lake Victoria, where he was raised. In an agricultural region, Amin mainly took care of goats and worked in the fields, receiving little academic preparation, where he only passed up to the 4th grade. His school attendance was sporadic, varying with his parents' ability to pay the study fees. Despite being raised in an environment full of deprivation and poverty, Idi Amin wanted to overcome the situation, and his first goal was to join the army. Uganda was a land where multiple groups lived, in which ethnic and tribal identity was very important. In the Great Lakes area, various kingdoms were formed from the 14th century. Among them, the Kingdom of Buganda stood out, from which Uganda gets its name. The region that grouped these ethnicities was colonized by the British during the 19th century, and in 1890, the Kingdom of Buganda and other kingdoms and peoples of the area are formally grouped in a negotiated manner under the British Protectorate of Uganda, a government under which the protagonist of our story is born. There are historians who believe that the young Ugandan may have served in Burma during World War II, however, there is no clear evidence of this. What is known is that in 1946, a year after the war ended, at the age of 21, he joined the African Regiment of the British Colonial Army, known as the African Rifles, to the King, where he initially served as an assistant cook. He was a tall man, very robust and skilled in the use of force, where thanks to his determination, he quickly rose through the military ranks. In his years as a recruit, Amin impressed his superiors with his physical condition, where he stood out as a good swimmer, rugby player, and boxer. He won the Uganda Heavyweight Boxing Championship and held the title for 9 consecutive years. His 1.93 meters in height and over 100 kilograms in weight were a significant support for this. Later in 1949, at 24 years old, Idi was promoted to corporal and participated in a group of expeditions against the thieves who were stalking the villages in northern Uganda. He was recognized by the military high command for being a skilled and particularly enthusiastic soldier, but he also became popular thanks to his coldness for violence. Proof of this is that his superiors began to seek him out to be part of the interrogations they conducted on suspicious enemies. However, the excessive brutality that Idi showed during these interrogations made him come close to being dismissed on several occasions. In 1953, he was sent to Somalia by the King's African Rifles to fight against the Shifta rebels. Once again, he fought on the side of the British during the repression of the Mau Mau rebel group in Kenya, according to the reports from that confrontation. Amin, who was known for being an enthusiastic rugby player, described hunting the Mau Mau as the best physical training a footballer could have. By 1959, he reached the rank of Sergeant Major, the highest position a black soldier could achieve under colonial rule. which leads him to be part of his military training in Stirling, Scotland. By the year 1961, Iri became one of the first two Ugandans to be a commissioned officer when he was promoted to lieutenant. But a year later, he gave the first signs that his capacity for violence could get out of hand, and his reserved personality began to be seen as dangerous. By the year 1962, in command of the troops of the King's African Rifles, he carried out the so-called Turkana Massacre, an operation aimed at controlling cattle theft by members of the tribes in the Turkana region, Kenya. However, the violence perpetrated was of such a level that the complaints of the villagers reached the British High Command in Nairobi, and it became evident that the victims of the massacre had been very badly treated, beaten to death, and, in some cases, buried alive. It is known that Idi Amin used to enjoy inflicting punishments on his rivals. However, the cruel treatments carried out in Kenya by Idi were not subjected to a court-martial because Uganda was on the eve of independence. Independence movements had been emerging in Uganda for decades, and during those years, negotiations with Great Britain for independence had gained more strength than ever before. Being aware of their fierce actions, the British authorities, led by Governor Sir Frederick Crawford and the leader of the Uganda People's Congress, Milton Obote, decided that Amin would not be prosecuted. Obote merely criticized him publicly and arranged for him to receive more military training in the United Kingdom. After more than 70 years under British rule, Uganda finally gained its independence on October 9, 1962. Thus, the first elections were held and Milton Obote became the Prime Minister of the nation, and the former king, Mutebi Mutesa, too, became the president of the government. That same year, in independent Uganda, Amin is promoted to captain, and in 1963 he receives the rank of major, in addition to being selected to participate in the commander's course at the Wiltshire Infantry School in Great Britain. Despite his lack of academic instruction, Iri proved to be one of the most capable military commanders in Uganda. From there on, Iri's military career, Amin positioned himself in the country's high spheres of power after establishing a close association with Prime Minister Obote. By 1964, Amin was appointed Deputy Chief of the Army and the Air Force of the nation with the rank of Colonel, strengthening his influence in Uganda. In turn, a dispute begins in the country between supporters of a centralized state and those who were more in favor of a federation with a greater role for the local tribal kingdoms. Added to this, 2 years later, in 1966, Obote and Amin were denounced for having been involved in a case of smuggling coffee, gold, and ivory out of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In response to a call for investigation by the President of Uganda and former King Edward Mutebi Mutesa II, who deemed the action of the Prime Minister illegal, Obote decides to strip the President of his duties, suspend the Constitution, and install himself as Executive President. The following year, he proclaims the Republic and traditional kingdoms are abolished. After seizing total power in Uganda in February of 1966, Ugandan leader Obote appointed Amin as his right-hand man, and he also grants him total command of the armed forces. While in the year 68, he promotes him to Division General. Amin was gaining more and more control over the armed forces, and secretly he was overwhelmed with the idea of taking control of the country. That's how he made the decision to start recruiting and promoting people who would be loyal to him within the ranks of the army, especially from the West Nile region. In turn, he relied on resources obtained from smuggling and supplying weapons to the rebels in southern Sudan, whom he was supporting. These movements began to break the trust between them, and Obote began to doubt the loyalty of his right-hand man, Amin. By 1969, social and ethnic divisions in Uganda deepened to the point where Obote's government became more solely dependent on the armed forces as a support to maintain its power. To ratify the order, military groups mobilized against unions, people's cooperatives, against cattle thieves, against opposition militants, and against students. The Ugandan president also took charge of dividing the army into two factions along ethnic lines. The troop structures of Milton Obote were formed of Nilotic soldiers, that is, mostly from the Acholi and Lango ethnic groups. On the other hand, Amin had in his ranks members predominantly from the West Nile ethnic groups, especially those who came from Sudan. Given the hostility and tensions that existed between them, the Ugandan president tried to limit Amin's power base, downgrading his position within the army. And Amin, for his part, became convinced that they were trying to neutralize him. As a result of Obote's growing dictatorial control and his unpopularity among the Ugandan people, Amin prepared so that any takeover of power on his part would make him seen as a sort of popular liberator. Just before traveling to Singapore in January of 1971 to attend a summit conference of Commonwealth leaders, President Obote, in the midst of these power struggles, denounces Amin and asks him for explanations for point 2, £5 million sterling that had been spent by the army. But faced with what seemed like an imminent arrest against him for embezzlement, Idi Amin decides to give his explanations shortly after, although they were not the explanations that Obote expected. While Obote was in Singapore, Idi Amin responds with a coup d'etat. Without much resistance, he takes control of Uganda and declares himself president on January 25, 1971. Initially, his actions were applauded by public opinion, both within and outside his borders. They looked favorably upon him, having overthrown the Obote regime, which was seen as tyrannical. The release of many political prisoners, and Amin's decision to allow the body of the former King Mutisa II to return from England to be buried with full honors were popular measures. At the time, the West was his strongest ally in his first year of government. Additionally, Uganda's secret police was disbanded. But at the same time, Amin takes charge of forming the so-called death squads, his own police, to pursue Obote's followers and eradicate any danger that could destabilize the aspirations of his mandate, especially from the ethnic groups that sought to remove him and tried to remove him from power at different times during his mandate. Among the internal security forces he formed are the Public Security Unit and the State Investigation Office, along with the military police. The organizations created by the Ugandan leader were a cause of fear throughout the country for their persecution, repression, and neutralization of dissidents and opposing ethnic groups. There were notable members of Ugandan society who paid with their lives for being seen as enemies, like a former prime minister and head of Ugandan courts, an Anglican archbishop, the former director of the Central Bank of Uganda, a university vice-chancellor, and 2 ministers from his own cabinet. The Nile Mansions Hotel, located in Kampala, the capital city, became infamous as the center of Amin's interrogations and cruel treatments during his regime. His extreme precautions soon turned into the rampant paranoia that some rulers develop, and when the excesses of his government came to light, the euphoria with which he was received soon turned into fear and uncertainty. And although he promised that he would be in office provisionally while free elections were held, such promise was never fulfilled. For 1972, the former president Milton Obote, who had exiled himself in Tanzania, tried to regain control of the country through a military coup but was unsuccessful. His supporters belonged to the Acholi and Lango ethnic groups, whom Amin considered enemies for power. Subsequently, after the failed coup attempt, Amin orders the execution of hundreds of these officers and soldiers within their barracks, and also responds by bombing cities in Tanzania. When news of the first executions within the barracks emerged, many assumed that the bloodshed would be limited only to the army, but it was not so. The punishments extended to thousands of civilians from the ethnic groups these officers belonged to. What about Obote? By the end of his first year in office, Idi Amin's security forces had ended the lives of approximately 10,000 Ugandans. Over the following years, tens of thousands more became victims of his government, while others sought refuge in neighboring countries or hid in Uganda. According to Agency P, there were so many corpses that they had to be thrown into the Nile River because there were not enough graves. On numerous occasions, Idi ordered televised public executions of individuals who were considered a threat or simply that he felt were conspiring against his regime. Amin also assumed in 1972 a policy he called the economic war, massively expropriating the businesses of Asians and Europeans to distribute them to his followers. Similarly, he ordered the expulsion of the Asian origin population from Uganda, which was part of a significant Indo-Eastern business class that numbered between 50 and 70,000 people, and he gave them 90 days to leave the country. This caused a severe deterioration of the economy as industry, agriculture, and trade collapsed without the resources and proper managers to handle them. That year, he also broke diplomatic relations with Great Britain and nationalized 85 British companies. This was followed by the expropriation of extensive lands, including more than 5,600 companies, factories, and farms, in addition to $400 million in personal property. Then he expelled Israeli military advisors who had supported him and became an open critic of Israel, thus breaking relations with that country, which had been one of his closest allies. At the beginning, Idi accuses the Israeli government of disrupting the order in Uganda. For this reason, he also orders all Israelis to leave the country. These actions earned him a bad image internationally and drew the attention of foreign media to the living conditions of the people of Uganda. Facing the Anglo-Saxon West, which begins to see its interests threatened in this region, Idi begins to break ties and establish closer links with governments such as those of the Soviet Union, Saudi Arabia, and Libya, which was ruled by Muammar Gaddafi. In addition to all this, Amin receives considerable international attention in 1976, when he allows revolutionary cells from Palestine and East Germany to use the Entebbe airport as a base to hold a group of hostages from an Air France plane they had hijacked in Israel. Amin claimed he was trying to negotiate the release of the passengers, but various indications suggested he was rather collaborating with the Palestinian hijackers. Subsequently, on the midnight of July 4, 1976, after a surprise attack carried out by Israeli squads, the hostages were rescued. However, the lack of explanation for the death of Dora Bloch, who was a British woman executed by Ugandan military, in apparent retaliation for the Israeli incursion into the Ugandan airport, it led to a breakdown in relations between Uganda and Great Britain. Idi Amin's leadership abilities also made that in 1975. He was elected as president of the Organization for African Unity, an old organization for the Union of African Peoples. This organization, among other things, achieved that in 1977. The African heads of state blocked a United Nations sanction that would have condemned Amin for human rights violations. That same year, when the last British diplomats left Uganda, Idi Amin added to his name the title of Conqueror of the British Empire, leaving his nominal name as that of His Excellence, lifetime President, Field Marshal Al-Hadid, Dr. Idi Amin, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, and conqueror of the British Empire and Africa in general and Uganda in particular. Another title that he did not give himself, but that he earned during his term and still resonates to this day, was the Butcher of Uganda. Over time, the number of Amin's allies and followers begins to decrease, and the previously loyal troops start to mutiny. Similarly, different groups of people start protesting for his resignation. When some Ugandans fled to Tanzania, Amin accused the Tanzanian president Julius Nyerere in 1978 of instigating public disorder in Uganda, and he retaliated by invading Tanzania, seeking to annex over 1,800 square miles of Tanzanian territory in the Kagera region. Subsequently, Tanzanian President Nyerere mobilized a counterattack to reclaim his territory and expelled Amin's army with the help of Ugandan exiles. But the Tanzanian army would not stop there and would launch into Ugandan territory. In this regard, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi sent troops at his disposal so that Idi Amin could face the conflict. But the military invasion by Tanzania, which also contained numerous Ugandan rebels, and the popular uprising that arose in those days could not be quelled. The battle spread throughout the country, and the government of Idi Amin came to an end on April 11, 1979, when the Tanzanian troops captured Kampala, the capital of Uganda. Given the circumstances, Idi Amin flees and is forced to take refuge in Libya in 1979 to later definitively exile himself in Saudi Arabia, where he resides. Under a modest lifestyle, different from the one that characterized him while he was in power. After failed attempts to regain power on August 16, 2003, Idi Amin dies in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, at the age of 78, after spending several weeks in a coma due to kidney failure. Being remembered in the modern era as many of the rulers who never had to pay for their crimes. His personal life was eccentric, but few details about his family were accurately recorded. According to historical compilations, he had a total of 6 wives and became the biological father of 43 children. The number of deaths during his term has never been unanimously established, but it is estimated to be between 80,000 and 400,000. The economy also suffered greatly during his years, and social conflict only worsened. What began with a celebrated takeover of power by the West ended in multiple denunciations and a shift in Uganda's relations towards Soviet and non-aligned sectors, not the West. The film The Last King of Scotland recalls this character, whose harshness remains a subject of interest and study. Reynaldo Carrillo spoke to you and hopes you enjoyed the video. This was the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to share the material that you like, to subscribe, and to follow us on our Instagram account, also called the New Encyclopedia.